Hi, Jeff.
Now I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Everyone, mind if I try to share my screen real quick? I just want to make sure it comes through all right. Oh, I need to be allowed to by the host.
Can you try again now?
Yes. No, host disabled participant screen sharing.
Oh, wait, here we go. Now you can.
Yes, that seemed to have worked.
Okay.
And everyone can see this all right?
Yep.
Great.
Awesome.
Good afternoon.
Hey, Michael.
Michael?
Hi.
So Evan, I'll introduce you and you can introduce the two different parts of our program. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
And do you have a feel for how much time we should spend on the first part versus how much time we should spend on the second part?
I don't. Yes, do you have a thought? Or maybe Ryan
Can you clarify, Jeff? Because I'm a little unclear.
Yeah, so if we're going to do, so how much time do you think we should allocate for adaptation versus action is sort of my question. So I'd like to, I'll be the official timekeeper, but I'd like to sort of keep us moving so we don't get bogged down and we don't get to the second part of the program.
We can probably do, I would say maybe 2/3, 1/3. There's definitely a few more slides on the adaptation side of things because there's a vulnerability assessment pieces. So probably 2/3, 1/3 is all right on that one.
Okay, so why don't we go like an hour and a half for the first part and then an hour for the second part? How about 60-40? Good enough? And then we'll be sure. I think Carrie has a hard stop at 6. So I think then we'll be sure that we allocate enough time. So if we fall behind a little bit, it'll be okay, but we'll shoot for 5 o'clock finish. And I'll try to use a light hand to sort of keep us on track. But I'll let you guys, I know that there's some prearranged stops in the program, and I'll let you guys sort of lead the meeting. And the only thing I'm going to do is introduce Evan and try to keep us on track. Sound good?
All right.
So in the interest of staying on track, we'll call the meeting to order. Today is the November 18th, and this is the Climate Committee. We're going to have a workshop today to talk about our adaptation and action plans I see Carrie, I see me, I see John Hill, I see Scott Lonergan. Lynette is not going to be able to make it, and I haven't heard from Michael, but we've got four of us here, so we'll call it good. The first order of business is public appearances. Members of the public are entitled to speak matters of committee concern, but not on the agenda. Do we have anybody that would like to speak today? Okay, so we'll proceed then on. Evan, would you like to introduce our speakers for today? And as I said before, I'll keep track and we'll try to switch topics at 5.
Yeah, sure. Ryan, do you want to start? Are you managing the slides?
That'll be Lexi.
Oh, Lexi. Okay, Lexi. If you want to share your screen, I can get rolling with the intros.
Definitely. Can everyone see my screen?
I cannot.
Okay, let me try that again. Sorry. How about now?
Yep, that looks good.
Great.
All right, so welcome to the Carmel-by-the-Sea Climate Adaptation and Greenhouse Gas Reduction Strategy Workshop. Lexi, if you can go on to the next slide. So the agenda for today, we will be discussing the project background and going into Carmel vulnerability to climate change, Carmel greenhouse gas reduction goals. And then there's 2 forms, one on the vision for the future in Carmel, and the second review of potential climate adaptation and greenhouse gas reduction strategies. The goal of this is to gather feedback on potential adaptation and mitigation actions for the city. To provide comments during the workshop, you can raise your hand using the raise hand button or provide comments in the chat. And we will break at various points to address the comments and questions during the mural portion of the presentation, which you'll see shortly. And then to provide comments after the workshop, you can email them directly to staff, and that email address will be provided at the end of the slideshow. So the Climate Action and Adaptation Project was initiated in 2019-2020 fiscal year. Climate action is the act of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and adaptation is the process of developing strategies to adapt to the changing climate. The committee was formed in fall 2019 with 8 members, 2 council members, Jeff Barron and Carrie Tice, 4 members of the public, John Hill, Michael LePage, Scott Lonergan, and Lynette Zimmerman, as well as 2 staff members, Anya Smartley, the environmental compliance manager, and myself, Evan Court, associate planner. And we have also brought on 2 consultants, Rincon Consultants and LSA Associates. Lexi Journey and Ryan Gardner are here today from Rincon, and Michael Hendricks is from LSA, who both groups will assist in presenting as part of the workshop. So progress to date, we had a monthly presentation series to understand climate threats and opportunities for action in Carmel, outreach to community groups and regional partners, climate change. We've prepared a climate change vulnerability assessment, greenhouse gas inventories, and a draft forecast, and a list of potential adaptation strategies, and a list of potential strategies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And with that, I will turn it over to Lexi Journey and Ryan Gardner from Rincon Consultants, who will take us through our climate change hazards.
Thanks, Evan, and hi, everyone. Thanks for having us here tonight. We're here to discuss the adaptation, climate change hazards, and adaptation part of the city's work that they're conducting right now. So we wanted to first talk about the vulnerability assessment, and then we'll go into the draft policies and actions to address these hazards. But before we do, we definitely wanted to give some background. So as Evan said, in July 2021, the city released the City of Carmel's vulnerability assessment, which we can put a link in the chat if folks want to look at that. And you'll see in the vulnerability assessment that it characterizes climate hazards that will impact the community and city-owned assets. It also describes the community's major climate vulnerabilities, and it identifies the work that has already been done by the city to improve resilience. And because we wanted the main focus of the meeting today, again, to go through those policies and getting feedback, we won't go into too much detail about the vulnerability assessment, but we did want to provide a general background and high-level results. So the vulnerability assessment concluded that the city currently experiences and will continue to experience climate impacts, including stronger storms, increased wildfire risk, sea level rise, extended drought conditions, and increased temperature. The orange hazards that you can see on the slide indicate hazards which already are observed or are very near-term significant risk. And then the yellow boxes indicate the hazards that are mid to long-range impacts. And the hazards in gray indicate that there isn't enough data on these hazards as of this point to really predict how they're going to impact the city. So I'll provide a little more context and explain each of these hazards. So for stronger storms, this is defined by a projected increase of year-to-year variability with wetter days during a rain event, but with fewer days with rain. So basically more rain over a shorter period of time and less frequent. This also means that storms will intensify and the rain will come in more intense bursts. Drought and increased temperature expected to increase the risk of wildfire as well, with the wildfire season that starts earlier, runs longer, and features more extreme fire events. For sea level rise, the Monterey County Multi-Jurisdictional Hazard Mitigation Plan estimates that Monterey County may experience an approximate 5-foot rise in sea level rise by the year 2100, and then increasing the range of inundation zone, so flooding, incrementally before that. So that is the sea level rise projection that was used in this analysis as well. And for even minor fluctuations in rainfall patterns, this will increase pressure on Monterey County's water resources, which are already overstretched by the demands of a growing agricultural economy and growing population. Research shows that wet years will become wetter and dry years will become drier. And dry years are also likely to be followed by dry years, increasing the risk of drought. So multiple dry years compounding. And then annual average maximum temperature in Carmel could increase by 3.3 degrees Fahrenheit by mid-century and 6.3 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century. Number of extreme heat days, defined as days with the daily maximum temperature above 87.9 degrees Fahrenheit, is also projected to increase from 3 days to an average of 6 days per year by mid-century, and to an average of 3 to 13 days per year by the end of the century. Now moving on to how these will impact Carmel. Well, climate change does not have the same effects in all parts of the community, as some people and physical assets will be more affected more severely than others. Therefore, the priority assets and populations at risk identified in the vulnerability assessment are categorized in these 3 main categories. They're community, natural environment, and infrastructure and built environment. So for what we mean by community assets, these include elderly populations and people with disabilities, residents, visitors, and then local businesses and workers. For the natural environment, this includes the beach, special habitat and open spaces on land and in the ocean, and the urban forest. And for infrastructure and built environment, this includes utilities, shoreline infrastructure, critical community facilities, and downtown residences. So even though we know all people and assets in the community will be affected by climate change, unfortunately, it's not feasible to assess the vulnerability of each group or asset. Because of this, the vulnerability assessment focused on those assets that face greater harm, require special consideration, and are crucial to the community's well-being. Now I'll discuss some of the high-level results of the vulnerability assessment by each asset category, starting with the impacts to community assets. As most of you are probably aware, there are CAL FIRE identified very high fire hazard severity zones in the city of Carmel. The map on the right shows the fire hazard zones designated by CAL FIRE. And even though wildfire risk can start to be mitigated on a property basis or building level through landscape design, building materials, there's also some city planning that is needed to help mitigate and respond to wildfire, such as plans for evacuating at-risk community members, such as older adults, at-risk workers, and businesses. Some other impacts to community assets include stronger storms that could lead to localized flooding, which could isolate residents, and increased temperature could lead to negative health impacts for older adults and individuals living with disabilities as well. For the natural environment assets, the vulnerability assessment identified the following climate change vulnerabilities: increased trees stress due to increased heat, and more variable water supply for the trees as well. Open spaces with sensitive habitats will be impacted by stronger storms, hotter temperatures, drought, and wildfires. And beaches and dunes could be lost from sea level rise. Climate change is also projected to cause ocean warming and acidification, which would impact the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary. And lastly, the vulnerability assessment identified that Carmel's urban forests lacks the age and species diversity to maintain healthy ecosystem function in response to these big climate stressors. In regards to infrastructure in the city, the vulnerability assessment identified the following infrastructure to be highly vulnerable. The access and utility infrastructure along the coastline was identified as a vulnerable asset, as well as coastal protection infrastructure, which include revetment, sand ramps, seawalls, and seawalls undercutting due to erosion and retreat of surrounding sandstone. There are 10 spots in the city with significant damage after storms. And for example, in the winter of 1982 to 83, as much as 40 feet of the bluff were lost in some areas of Carmel. The storm drain system is also designed to handle 10-year storms and in need of repairs, as well as the wastewater facility will need to be relocated by 2062, as the Carmel Area Water District conducted a sea level rise study for their wastewater treatment facility in 2018. And according to the study, increased storm intensity as well as sea level rise may affect the facility in 40 years. And lastly, power grid impacts could occur due to increased wildfires and storms. And then for the last asset category, the built environment, the vulnerability assessment identified the following vulnerability related to buildings and structures in the city. The current city planning guidelines conflict with the California fire codes and that very high fire severity zone. For example, natural materials and residential design guidelines that the city has are standard for buildings and roofs. However, these can be a fire risk, so the city council has been making exceptions to these guidelines. And then lack of defensible space around homes is an issue. Also, extreme heat may lead to increased use of air conditioning, which could tax the electrical grid and cause power outages. Lastly, there is generally a lack of cooling infrastructure around the city, such as public shading, green roofs, and more vegetation and asphalt that is heat resistant. So I think at this point, I'll go ahead and hand it off to Michael Hendricks from LSA to discuss the climate change mitigation in Carmel.
Yes, and if you don't mind moving to the next slide. Thank you. So this is a forecast between 2015 and 2045 of emissions in the city of Carmel-by-the-Sea. And we also have on this chart 3 reduction targets, one for 2020, one for 2030, and one for 2045. The 2020 target was a 15% reduction from a baseline inventory. And then the 2030 target is an additional 40% reduction of the 2020 target. And then of course, 2045, the state is planning to go carbon neutral. So if you look at this chart, that red line is what we call business as usual. It's on a slightly downward track due to slight population decreases and activity. The green shaded area is what we're expecting from state level regulations like the low carbon fuel standard, renewable portfolio, and such. The red hashed area is left for local reductions. And as we go through the reduction measures later, we really want to focus on 2030. We don't want to get caught up in trying to solve everything all at once and get us on the right trajectory for that ultimate goal in 2045. Next slide. Thank you. So this is a pie chart that shows the inventory by different sectors. You'll notice that residential, it has the largest amount of emissions, roughly 36%. This is residential energy, which comprises of electricity and natural gas. And then the commercial industrial sector of almost 25%, again, is electricity and natural gas. On-road transportation, primarily passenger vehicles, is just over 31%. That comprises over 90% of the emissions for the city of Carmel. Solid waste is a little under 8%, and then wastewater, as you can see, is very small. So as we're looking at reduction measures later on, here's where we're going to focus the reductions on those areas that are the highest potential to reduce and also have the highest percent of total emissions. Next slide.
Thanks,
So
Michael.
Go ahead.
Yeah, for that background. So I know we talked about a lot of information, so we wanted to take a break here and hear from folks in the audience. And we have a couple questions proposed to the group and a mural exercise so we can hear people's thoughts and note them down. So I will stop sharing my screen so we can pass it off to Ryan, who will show the note screen. But just to get you guys start thinking, the questions we want people on the phone to start thinking about are what aspects of Carmel will help the community's resilience. So thinking of what great things about Carmel that will help, and then what actions have the city or constituents taken to reduce their impact and adapt to climate change. So we can have people go ahead and put responses of their thoughts in the chat, and then I'll read them aloud and Ryan will put them in this note-taking mural. And if folks also want to raise their hand and just say their thoughts vocally, we can record that as well. And I don't think we have too many people on the phone, so I think if people just want to unmute themselves and talk, that's fine too. Don't necessarily have to raise your hand since we have a small group. All right, Ryan, we have our first comment, safety during weather events.
Hey, Jeff, did you want to expand on that comment?
Well, what I'm thinking about primarily is stuff like drainage and power outages. You know, two items that are pretty big on our list. You know, make sure that we don't have houses flooding or worse, rolling down the hill, and that the community is capable of survive. You know, sort of mitigating and or surviving bad outages. We have had outages here in the past that have run into the days. And I don't know if we're, it's hard to know if we're still subject to outages that are that long. I know we had one, 2 years ago that was a day and a half. To me, this has ramifications as well on our sort of vulnerable populations, the people that live, the folks that live in the foundation housing. You know, we have shut-ins. We have some shut-ins around town, elderly folks that don't necessarily get out of their homes or communicate particularly well. And if we're expecting more events of this nature in the future, then we should be better prepared for those events than how we are now.
Definitely. We have a few other comments in the chat, a couple from Nancy, looking for suggested items that we can do personally for what we do for our consumables and more. So I think this is speaking a little bit more to the mitigation side. And then another comment is from Nancy is I'd like to see more pointers on how to shift to solar for heating. So again, comments on climate mitigation. And then similarly, we have a comment from, we actually have, okay, I'll go to the comment from Laura first, and then we'll go to that question. From Laura, I think heat pumps for heating and cooling structures are great because one appliance can do both heat and cool and are way more efficient than other kinds of heating and cooling.
Yeah, I think I would say, in response to sort of Nancy and Laura at the same time, I think that's a really interesting area of development that's going on now. These both air-to-air and air-to-water heat pump technology seems to be really going somewhere. And to Nancy's point, I'm no longer convinced. As someone who has solar panels on my house to heat it via a water system, I'm no longer convinced that that's necessarily the right thing to do, given heat pump technology. Like, why should I have thermal panels rather than electric panels that in turn run a heat pump? So I think that there are certainly interesting technologies that seem to be sort of appearing on the horizon, given the demand for lower energy consumption, and electrification as it is.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. We also got another thumbs up on alternatives.
There was a question from Jay Gentry that Michael might want to address. He was asking on the last chart if the pie represents greenhouse gases and involves natural gas and electricity. What's the impact of one versus the other?
So yeah, we combined energy for residential and commercial. It shows both natural gas and electricity. I can say since you are within 3 CE programs, your electricity emissions are pretty low, but the natural gas component of energy is remaining high. So where we can reduce natural gas is really going to shrink those portions of the pie chart.
Yeah, my question was, does the pie, the way that it's sorted out, does that include just the percentage of electricity that's being provided by natural gas or oil or coal being burned, or is that all of the electricity? Because if it's the otherwise, the number would be either bigger or and it's confusing the way that it was there, and I just wanted a clarification if I could get.
Sure. So it's a composite of both electricity consumption of all sorts of generation, including solar, wind, hydro, natural gas, and imported electricity.
Yeah,
and the consumption of natural gas by the homeowners.
Right. Well, but the chart says GHGs.
Well, it is.
And hydro, you don't get GHGs from hydro or other renewable things. So is the chart just total energy usage, or is the chart energy usage that creates GHGs?
So it is the GHG emissions associated with the total energy use, both natural gas for heating and electricity for the other uses.
Okay.
Michael, I would say that I had the same issue as Jay, You know, and maybe you could, if you could put the chart back up on the screen for a second, if we have that pie chart available.
I'll pull it up.
I would, you know, my suggestion, you know, I had in fact exactly the same issue as Jay did. And my suggestion as one way to maybe make it clear what this chart is, I think it's on the previous slide.
Back one.
Because I think it's a really nice chart, and I think it really depicts where we have to work, would be to take those three big sectors, transportation, residential, and commercial, and divide them into you know, the amount of greenhouse gases that are coming from electricity generation. So like you said, the residential portion, the electrical residential portion of our greenhouse gases is right now pretty small because of 3CE. And so take each of those three sections and divide them into greenhouse gases from electricity versus greenhouse gases from fossil fuels. And I think I think, for example, if you had if you took commercial and industrial, we basically don't have industrial. So if you took a commercial and you split that brown pie chart into brown number 1 and brown number 2, and one of them said electricity and one of them said natural gas. You know, however it is, I think that would make it clearer. Does that?
Sure, we can actually have pie charts for residential and commercial energy sectors so that you can really get into the different components of electricity versus natural gas use. Oh, and my suggestion is to do that rather than try and subdivide this chart up too much, but we can take those two sectors in particular and subdivide them to the within the different energy components of it.
Does that address your concerns?
If you could break it down on the electricity would be a pie, and then some of that electricity doesn't do greenhouse gas or comes without greenhouse gases. What that mix is would get us a better idea, because we really can't tell by looking here how valuable it would be to go to the heat pumps for heating and cooling or heat pump water heaters, because they're just still, you know, if it's electricity being used instead of gas to do that, the water heaters and heaters are more efficient than gas, but still, it doesn't give us the ability to prioritize actions to get to the numbers that we're looking for in 2030 and 2045. So anyway, I'll step back now. I just found this chart to be, I don't know what it's misrepresenting because it doesn't show. It doesn't tell us what's actually in the blue or the orange.
Hey Jay, this is greenhouse gas emissions. So this does not incorporate energy that is green energy. That's not included in this chart. This is just greenhouse gas emissions. So this is the portion of electricity that generates greenhouse gas, as well as the natural gas that also generates greenhouse gas. So
okay,
we do have.
And I agree with Jeff that it would be helpful to see the two, just to break apart.
And we do have that level of detail. We didn't include it in this presentation, but we do have it, and we can tell you that the greenhouse gas units in houses is what generates the most greenhouse gases. I mean, the natural gas units.
Yeah, and I think to Jay's point again, and I'll stop after this. I think seeing the number, like if you look at residential, which is 35.9%, I think if the chart said 35.7% of it was natural gas, was like the actual burning of natural gas, and 0.2% of it was greenhouse gas emissions through electrical generation, I think that would address sort of Jay's confusion and my confusion. Like I understand, you know, in my brain that, you know, because we use 3CE, we don't have very many greenhouse gas emissions, you know, from electrical use. But I'm not sure that the reader of the report will necessarily understand that when they get to this pie chart. And I think that's a really important, I think that the reduction of the burning of fossil fuels is really what we're going to be all about. And I think this is where that thought train starts. It starts right here with this chart.
Yeah, and exactly, and the electrification or the decarbonization, the stopping of putting gas hookups in and things might be a very important step to take, but we can't see how big a step it is unless we have the separate thing there. So thank you for that.
Yes, and we can provide a breakdown on both residential and commercial, the energy sectors in particular.
And to your point, Michael, I think this also applies to transportation too, because we're talking about, later on in the presentation, you talk about electrifying the fleet, and we're going to have a conversation about VMTs. Well, the same thing goes for automobiles as it does for, burning, in this case, gasoline or diesel fuel.
Yes, currently in our analysis, we didn't divide it up by diesel versus gasoline, but we could do that fairly easily.
I basically, it's just electricity versus fossil fuels.
Yeah.
Right.
All right. Good discussion. Let's see what else we have in the comments here. I think where Laura said the largest piece of the pie was residential. I think increasing, now I can't see the chat. Increasing efficiency of existing structures, requiring that new structures be built to a very high performance level, and eliminating new gas connections would be great. Reach codes are good for that, like the city of Berkeley. So we'll capture that comment. The other comment is, how is the city planning and codes being reviewed for meeting issues around both residential and commercials? Does the city want to answer that one?
Yeah, I can take that. So like it was mentioned earlier, there is some conflict between our zoning code and design guidelines, at least from the planning department's standpoint, regarding maintaining the character of the city and meeting, I guess addressing issues that have been identified as part of our vulnerability assessment. So that we are looking to update both our zoning code and residential design guidelines in the near future. And this exercise that we're doing today, can potentially help guide those updates to become more consistent with our vision for Carmel. On the building side, I'm not with the building department, so I can't speak as directly to those standards. But this year, the Title 24, which is the energy code update, basically it's updated every 3 years. The city adopts it regularly. The building code basically prescribes energy efficient standards. So every 3 years we get an update that basically by design requires buildings to become more and more energy efficient.
Thanks, Evan. And I know we had one more question that we wanted to ask the group to help with this visioning exercise. And we love to talk about actions, but seeing if people had an idea of scoping out a little bit in terms of what does a resilient Carmel community look like and what outcomes are we hoping to achieve? So I know the safety comment speaks to that, equity speaks to that, but just wanted to prompt that in case there's anything else that folks wanted to add in terms of what does this community look like and what are those outcomes?
Well, I'll jump in. I mean, I would say that, you listed earlier in the presentation the assets. And I would say that there would be a vision associated with each of those assets. So, for example, when we talk about the urban forest, which is a pretty important part of town, a pretty important, not physical part of town, but intellectual part of town, I think that we all want to have an urban forest, and we all want that urban forest to be resilient. So I think that, like, there's an example of something that should be resilient. I don't know how to get there. I don't think it's necessarily this committee's idea, this committee's task to get there. I think that's the Forest and Beach Commission's task to sort of make a proposition, and maybe we could hand this off to them. I think the same thing would go for the beach, and so on down the list, down the list of assets.
Yeah, then you're really going to like our next part where we talk about goals and policies, and that's exactly how they're organized. So, good segue. And we do have one more comment that says, unfortunately, Title 24 building code reflects the lowest requirements needed. It's like passing with a D. That is not a very high bar. So, comment in terms of wanting the city to go above and beyond those requirements.
Well, let me ask Michael, given that comment about Title 24, I assume that, at some level, the modeling that you're going to do will tell us that Title 24 isn't going to work for us. We've had conversations about VMTs and all sorts of things. And if we do a sort of a strict adherence to this lowest common denominator, this Title 24, presumably we won't make our targets, and your model will show us that that's the case. Is that correct?
Yes, and if you went to that line chart that had the green shaded area, that green shaded area is a combination of Title 24, low carbon fuel standard, the other state requirements, that minimum requirement that is going to occur even if Carmel does not have a climate action and adaptation plan. So you can see that red hashed area between the targets and that green area, which is the state requirements, including Title 24. That red hashed area is all of the challenges and opportunities of reducing emissions to get down to that target. So it's a big lift for the city.
Michael, does that chart anticipate the current Title 24 requirements, or does that look at the new requirements that are going to be instigated by Title 24 beginning 2023? Is that including that?
Yes, it does include the 2023 Title 24 and things that we have strong indication that they will occur in the iteration after that, getting to 2030. You'll notice that green shaded area starts to level off post 2030 because we don't assume additional reductions. When we get a scoping plan update, we'll probably have more to say on that.
Thanks.
We had another comment in the chat that says top priorities or most urgent needs to protect assets in the city, and what is the potential cost by line item around those plans? Reductions and actions can have significant cost aspects to meet scope.
Well, I can take that one on. That's why we're here today. This committee is going to present to the city recommendations for capital improvements based on what we feel is needed to mitigate some of these aspects of climate change. So that's what we're in the process of developing, especially when you consider sea level rise and how that may affect our bluffs, our scenic pathway, our storm drains that empty in that area. So good point on that. And that's what we're working on.
Thank you. We also said non-action is way more expensive, and then we have an agreed comment as well. All right. Is there any other comments, questions people wanted to voice before we move on into the policies and actions portion of the presentation? All right, not hearing any. I'll go ahead and share my screen again. Thanks, Ryan. so now for the main objective of the meeting and why we wanted to meet with everyone today is to review the goals, policies, or measures, as they can be called, policies or measures, and the actions that the city is currently developing to help the city adapt to climate change and reduce their contribution to climate change. The way city planning documents work is to have an overarching goal that is a broad statement of what the community desires and wants to achieve. And then for each goal, there are policies that are specific position statements that support the achievement of the goals and serve as guides to the city when they're making decisions. And then the actions are a method that the city will take to implement and achieve policies and ultimately the goals. So these are drafts form as they are right now. This is why we're bringing them here at this time to get feedback. So time to add, edit. And the way that they are organized in terms of climate adaptation goals, they are organized by those asset categories. So goal 1 is a health and safe and resilient community. Goal 2 is a natural environment resilient to climate hazards. And goal 3 is resilient infrastructure and built environment. Now we'll jump into each of the policies and talk generally about the actions under each one. So the first policy under the healthy, safe, and resilient community is the policy is to provide effective emergency preparedness and response in anticipation of potential climate-related disasters. So the actions under this policy really aim to improve emergency preparedness and evacuation, as well as reducing wildfire risk. So to give example of a couple actions, there's one to collaborate with Monterey Fire, and that's collaborating with Monterey Fire on its inspection and outreach efforts to reduce fire risks and help distribute information to increase resident awareness and acknowledge how to prepare for emergencies. Another one is publicized local evacuation routes. So publicizing evacuation routes on both the city and Monterey County evacuation sites, especially among the most vulnerable in the event of a wildfire or other disaster. Another evacuation action is in regards to access, investigating potential congestion issues in the event of evacuation, and develop and maintain a list of residents who may have difficulty evacuating and providing evacuation options such as shuttle service for residents with mobility challenges. And the last one I'll describe is increased resistance to wildfire structural damage, evaluating the feasibility of gaining Firewise community certification in neighborhoods within Carmel-by-the-Sea. So I'll just go through these for this goal, and then we'll do a same mural exercise where people can write notes. So just let you know that's how the format is. So the next policy under this goal is to focus adaptation efforts and engagement in the most vulnerable populations. So an example action is to establish a resilience hub, and ensuring that a resilience hub such as the Youth Center for Public Library is available during extreme heat events, poor air quality, severe weather events, and other highly hazardous conditions for use by the community. And that resilience hub would have essential resources such as food, refrigeration, charging stations, medical supplies, and emergency supplies. And that resilience hub would also have electrified heating and cooling with backup power sources like battery storage. And then another example action is educating the community to ensure the community knows about the Resilience Hub and know how to access it by sharing updates across city and community channels, as well as partnering with the CERT program and block captains to prioritize marginalized communities. And another example action is backup power for vulnerable populations. So coordinating with 3CE, PG&E, and emergency management services to establish backup power and emergency grid shutdown protocols that protect the most vulnerable populations. The next policy for community resilience is minimizing health impacts of climate change. So one action would be partnering with Monterey County Health Department. So coordinating with the health department to develop and enhance disaster and emergency early warning systems to incorporate data and information for potential health risks, such as heat illness, and illness due to low air quality. Another one was initiating a heat pump retrofit program, creating a program to aid homeowners in converting to heat pumps to provide water heating and space heating, in addition to cooling, and can improve air quality. Another action is improving resilience in critical facilities, so investing in sustainable backup power sources for city facilities. Another one is conducting a feasibility study for existing building electrification so that you can understand the potential for and costs of electrification retrofitting, including heat pumps and battery storage. Electrifying fireplaces, another one, and identifying funding and financing by working with 3C and PG&E to pay for electrification and battery backups. And then another policy under resilient communities are supporting displaced workers by working with the Monterey County workforce and establishing a partnership to develop a resilient economy. That involves partnering with the County of Monterey Economic Development Department, the Chamber of Commerce, and the Workforce Development Board to develop more integrated strategies for protections of jobs and prevention of vulnerable populations at risk that could be dislocated due to climate change. And then lastly, building a resilience outreach program. And that could be a pilot and implementing with local businesses to build small business capacity before a disaster occurs. So now we'll go ahead back to the mural and get some feedback and discussion on those policies that were just presented. And let's see if there's any comments that we have so far. All right, so if you can kind of see in this mural on the share screen, we have the overall policies listed here if you need reminders of those. We do have one comment already that says, I want to stress that our existing housing stock will be around for quite a while. And a lot of the homes here were built a long time ago and are very energy hungry. So increasing the energy efficiency of existing housing stock is crucial, I think.
And just a thought on that, the existing housing stock's also more vulnerable to some of the climate change risks, excessive heat days, fire and wildfire potential, those kinds of things. So it gets into more than just the energy and efficiency, but also some of the other ways that they could be retrofitted to make them more climate resilient.
Yeah, I agree with Michael's comments about that. And I think we should try to fit that stuff in here somewhere and at least acknowledge what that particular issue is. I think I've raised this before. I have a bit of an issue with most of policy 1.3. And I think that my issue is, so I'm just gonna choose one off of here. Conduct a feasibility study for existing building electrification. I don't understand, and perhaps you can help me, how existing building electrification, given we just talked about it, but how existing building electrification is going to make our infrastructure more resilient. Like, so I live in a house that has natural gas, and I don't understand, honestly, how if I convert from natural gas to electricity, my house is going to be more resilient. That doesn't make any sense to me. And I know that this is a greenhouse gas issue, and I accept that. And my question is, why is that item and some of the other items in 1.3, why are they in here? And as sort of some background, my sort of goal here, my own personal goal, and I'll leave this up to the committee, is that we should stay focused on, in this report, on things that really do have to do with climate. So I was quizzed by a friend of mine about why we're not talking about reducing the amount of plastic. And I think that that's an admirable goal, but I don't think that's necessarily climate related. And I'm a little worried that if we start straying from our climate goals, that it's going to dilute the power of our report.
I'll just provide a little color to that. So the idea behind improving health through electrification is that combusting natural gas inside your home releases a fairly significant amount of air pollutants. It's probably the largest source of NOx in California is from existing buildings combusting fuel. So what's interesting is like on a power plant, if you burn natural gas, it goes through a stack that's very closely analyzed. That process is very, very closely monitored. Alarms buzz when you go over certain thresholds. When you burn natural gas in your house, you are, just lighting a burner and you're getting incomplete combustion. So they've actually been able to link natural gas combustion to asthma and other health impacts. And the thought is that as we have more extreme, like bad smoke days, higher heat days, you're getting worse air quality, and that's getting exacerbated by burning natural gas in your house. Maybe you have all your windows shut, you have less airflow. So it's exacerbating those conditions that we're seeing outside from climate change. So, while it's not like a super direct adaptation measure, like building a seawall, I do think it connects, and then it also connects into the mitigation side where you're decreasing your emissions. So it's one of those things that has kind of a few different co-benefits in addition to the direct greenhouse gas reduction benefit. So I think that's kind of the thought there.
Okay, so I take that. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for that explanation, Ryan. And I would ask that when we put our report together, that we include a paragraph about that, so that I don't have to have the same conversation with someone on the other side and go through this whole explanation. So that would be useful for me, as a member of this committee. And the other thing my other comment here was I would like to see, I think these are all good actions. And I agree with the actions. I don't really have any comments on the inclusion of the actions, but I would personally like to see the committee make more specific recommendations under the actions. So, for example, educate the community. That's a good action, but it doesn't really mean, like, I'm afraid that if we make an action like that, we're going to send this to the city council and the community, and people are going to look at it and say, what does that mean? And so the work isn't going to get done. I think that's more, it's more like action 1.1.8, which is update city planning guidelines in the fire hazard zones. I think those are good. That's a pretty big action. And I would like to see us, I don't want to micromanage the city, but, in this case, I would say, have the planning commission do this or have the city council do that, and put some detail behind these things so that the report has, gets traction in terms of goals. We always talk about SMART goals. These actions might be a little bit better if they were sort of more concrete and more smart, if that makes sense. So that's sort of my reaction. And so I'll just say that here, and then I won't say it anymore through the rest of the talk.
Jeff, yeah, you make a good point that I forgot to bring up too, is that the city wanted to use this time to get a sense of the priorities of what people thought, maybe what actions should be higher priorities than others, knowing the reality that the city's not going to be able to do everything at the same time. So what should the city prioritize in terms of accomplishing first? So if people have thoughts on that, we definitely want to hear those too. We got another comment from Laura that says solar plus batteries at locations like the fire department and the police department and the youth center would be great for resilience, not to mention the water treatment facility and elderly communities. So yeah, I think that goes to that comment in terms of maybe providing more details in terms of the actions and prioritizing that. And then she also says that burning natural gas increases greenhouse gas emissions. Electrifying does that much less, especially as our grid gets cleaner and cleaner.
You know, to your point about prioritization, since no one has spoken to that yet, I would say that the thing that we hear, and I'm sure Carrie will agree with this, from everybody in the community is about wildfire. And I think that my own thinking here, and I would, you know, certainly like to hear what the other committee members say, because they have a sort of an unjaded perspective of not having heard from quite everybody yet, is that things that have anything to do with wildfire, whether it's you know, evacuation routes or hardening the landscape or hardening homes or whatever it is, those things should migrate to the top of the list more than to the bottom of the list.
I agree, Jeff.
So Lexi, are we going through like each one of these policies individually, maybe kind of try to get some more ideas around specific actions for each of these policies, or what's the game plan here?
I think the plan was, well, we still need to go through the natural environment and building goals. So right now we're just on these community ones. And I think we were just planning on, as people had comments on any of these policies. But yeah, if people, I know we didn't really talk about the evacuation very much. If people have comments on that, we've had some comments on engagement efforts and health.
Does anyone have concerns about any of these impacts we talked about to the community in Carmel? Like, are you particularly worried about increased temperatures or drought and think there's something that we should be doing as a community to help kind of hedge against those things?
Fire.
Drought. Definitely the drought issue, because that leads to the fire issue. So that's a good point. Temperature, you know, our temperatures here, you know, when you say we're going to go from 3 days of over 87 degrees to 6 days, that doesn't worry me as much as the rise in sea level and the drought issue and the severe storm issue.
I agree with Carrie, and I would make a suggestion as we look down these actions. Maybe one right thing to do would be to prioritize the actions in terms of their priority. So I'm looking at the actions under policy 1.1. You know, action 1.1.1, which is the CERT team. I love my CERT team. Hi, Wanda and the D's and everybody else, and Scott. But I would say that that's not more important than, for example, maintaining and updating the evacuation plan. So maybe rearranging the order a little bit, you know, when you guys sort of disappear before next month, in terms of priority, that might be helpful.
Any other thoughts on kind of generally how to prioritize? Like, are there things that you think should be a priority for each of these policies, or, you know, not you, Jeff, specifically, but kind of everyone on the call? You know, there are a lot of topics and a lot of things that we could prioritize. And I think maybe some feedback on, you know, do we prioritize, community safety or specific pieces of the community or planning at this stage? Kind of how are you thinking about priorities?
Anybody? You know, I would say fire and the elderly population that's of the city. Like, those are the things that sort of go to the top of the list. You know, fire and to somewhat of a a lesser extent, storms.
And we also have a comment of creating a clear evacuation plan for the elderly community would be a priority. A couple other comments while people think. We have a comment in terms of many of the items you just listed have been covered by our fire, police chief, and other local experts. This is you can take them to water, but you can't make them drink it. So maybe that's in terms of a priority. We know that there's different agencies and departments planning for several things, but making sure that they're actually implemented by the departments could be a priority, or collaboration. You're getting maybe departments getting funding to make sure that the overlapping types of actions are funded and can happen.
Yeah, I would call out this comment from Laura about Firewise community certification. We did have a presentation on that specific item, I think 2 months ago, and I think everybody was really interested in that. So I think that deserves a spot on here. Maybe not at the very top, but since it applies to fire, certainly in the middle somewhere. We had the presentation. It's a pretty significant effort. And so there's probably some council policy direction there on what to do about it, but I think it deserves to be listed.
Great, Ryan, just so you note it down, that's the Firewise community certification.
Yeah, I got it here.
Okay, cool.
I guess any thoughts on, I like this idea of, we talked a little bit about, hey, there's all this planning going on, and you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. Are there thoughts about how to get these plans out to the community in like a way that they'll actually engage with or take seriously? Just any thoughts on actions that can be taken to make sure all this work we're doing to plan is actually getting out to folks and they understand how it works and how to use it?
Yeah, and I think Nancy's comment in the chat speaks a little bit to that. That says the residents that care about preparedness know what to do or where to go and to get the info, but the residents that don't care are the bigger challenge. And also we don't have an easy way to engage with part-time vacation rental homeowners. So people maybe have thoughts or ideas of how engagement could be improved.
Yeah, I'm part of a sort of a nation neighborhood organization effort, and we're off to a pretty slow start, but we do have an infrastructure there and that could be used for communication. I think this has come up before. Carrie, I don't know if we're one of the other committee members. We've had some brief conversations about neighborhood organization, which might be an avenue with which to implement the things that Ryan is talking about. I don't know, I think Nancy's right. This is a difficult problem, especially with the second homeowners, but we're not going to have to evacuate a lot of the second homeowners because they're not going to be here.
Any other thoughts on engagement?
I think just one other I'd call out that seems relatively easy is to just update our codes to match and not conflict with the California codes. And I don't even know what those are, but it sounds like a relatively easy one to do.
Yeah, we can put that in a high priority category, getting code consistency. There's a question here from, go ahead.
I kind of wanted to tear off that. I've been kind of just trying to figure out my comment. It kind of goes back to 1.1 though, and not 1.2. And I know the committee's looked at this for some time, but just thinking about it now, just another comment under action item 1.1.8 and 1.1.9. Why limit it to just the very high fire severity zones. I mean, the whole city is at risk to fire. You know, feel like it should just be expanded to the whole city. Just have a kind of a blanket regulation instead of if you are just in this designated zone.
Yeah, and in fact, to Evan's point, we had this exact conversation at the council right after I joined. And Carrie, I don't remember what the exact topic was, whether it was roofs or tree cover or something, but the council at that point made sort of I wouldn't call it a hasty decision, but made sort of a short-term decision to do exactly as Evan proposes. Oh, I think it was about roofs. It was about roofing structures in high fire zones versus non-high fire zones. And I think the council made the decision to treat everybody the same as if we were all in a high fire zone. So we have sort of gotten halfway there, Evan, to making that decision.
There are a couple more comments. Are there any good examples to look at when it comes to community engagement? And I know that this community loves to drink and eat. Can we have a series of educational wine and dine events? I think that's a really good idea. When the first example one came out, I was thinking of the block captain approach I've seen work well in other communities, especially elderly. So I don't know if maybe the city had thoughts on how their block captains are typically working, but I think that wine and dine events are even better. That sounds something that might be more fun and you can get more people to go to.
Well, we have a strong restaurant community, so that's a good suggestion. And wine.
Mm-hmm.
Should we move on to the next group so we don't run out of time?
Yeah, that sounds great. Just one last comment for you, Ryan, to capture is how about streamlining building permits to projects that are high performance and fire resilient? And then if you want to stop sharing your screen, I'll go back to the slides. Okay, so to review the policies under the goal that relates to protecting and restoring climate vulnerable habitat and ecosystems, that is the first policy under this goal, and the actions, increasing funding for climate adaptation. So earmarking capital improvement program, CIP funding, for adaptation projects, including stream stability study projects, and including those projects that are in the multi-jurisdictional hazard mitigation plan and the watershed management program, as well as those have opportunities for regional funding. Another action, increasing forest resilience, so updating the forest management plan to include adaptation, increasing resilience of the Mission Trail Nature Preserve and updating their Preserve Master Plan to consider impacts of climate change and specifically reducing wildfire risk to neighboring private properties. Another action, increasing resilience of North Dunes by continuing maintaining and monitoring those dunes, increasing resilience to stronger storms. When designing projects in the city, size improvements to be able to handle larger storms, consistent with the best available climate change projections. Another action is a beach sand monitoring program that's described in the shoreline management plan and the Carmel Cove sand study. So reaching out to local researchers like Cal State Monterey Bay to conduct Carmel Cove sand supply dynamics analysis. So these are the actions and the policies for the natural environment. So we'll let people look at these for a little bit, and then we can do the same type of activity that we did in the mural. So looking at people's prioritization of these certain actions, what we think is most important, and trying to see if there's anything we missed or any other maybe specifics that should be added to make them more implementable. So I'll let you share the mural again.
Seems like there's a lot of work wrapped up in this one policy.
Yeah, and I know the policies addressed fire and sea level rise and drought. If folks think those are the main priorities, or if there are some other ones that they should address.
I think it's worth noting, you know, there's a policy in here that's about beach sand monitoring and sand supply analysis. And the one thing that we were not able to do because of budget constraints was to hire the sort of shoreline engineer. And I don't wonder if
I think you got muted, Jeff.
Sorry. I don't wonder if these sand policies should be sort of under bulleted behind an item that says do version 1.5 of this report, which is to hire that shoreline engineer and figure out what to do in sort of a more scientific way about sea level rise. Because that is the one area that I don't think we've really done enough work. Again, because of the budget, and this all seems to fall under there.
Yeah, so you're saying have the shoreline engineer help with that prioritization, like which issues should be addressed first? I
almost want to say have the action be hire the shoreline engineer, and then we can add these things as sort of bullets under that, because I'm not sure we know, since we didn't do this, I'm not sure we know exactly what the issues are. Like we talk about strengthening the revetments and coming up with policies about unguarded shore, unguarded cliffs, and stuff like that. And this is something that I don't think we know enough about. In other words, this is a little bit of a murky area to me.
I agree. We really don't know what the whole impact is going to be to the shoreline. So and part of, obviously the shoreline is also the sand. So I think that's going to be part of the encompassing study.
Great. We also had another comment that says consider hiring a grant writer to gain additional funding as an action item.
The city has been wanting to do that but due to budget constraints, we haven't been able to, but that's something I think there's several areas, not only climate change, where a grant writer could be helpful, as Agnes knows. Right now, Agnes is mainly our grant writer, but we could add that as a potential suggestion.
Great. Yeah, I know grant writing and gaining funding is a lot of work. In an ideal world, we're like, oh, we could do that on top of the work we already do, but that doesn't seem to happen in real life. Some other policy or actions that we talked about were increasing the forest resilience and update to the forest management plan. And also the Mission Trail Nature Preserve Master Plan. So we talked about the beach and sea level rise. I'm curious if people have thoughts on the forest side of things. I know we got a comment earlier that should be a priority, but if there are any additional thoughts in terms of adaptations for the forested areas.
I don't wonder if we should separate out, sort of make a distinction between Mission Trail Nature Preserve and Forest Hill Park and the various other park, I think those are the two parks that we have that are pretty much forest versus the urban forest. I don't really know. Yeah, so I'm like action 2.1.2. Maybe it should be bifurcated into, the urban forest, which is the trees that we all live under, versus the forest, which is, I don't know, maybe that's already 2.1.3.
I interpreted 2.12 as being specific to the urban forest. Is that not how you were thinking about that, Jeff? Or?
Scott, I see the words forest management plan, and I'm always a little bit, unsure about whether they're talking about the forest in Forest Hill Park and Mission Trail Nature Preserve, or the forest in where we all live.
I believe that has to do with the forest where we all live.
Yeah.
And sort of is the guiding document for the forester and, our ordinance related to trees.
Okay. But I think the way that the details on under 0.12 in my mind are specific to urban portions of it. So I think that's something I agree with Jeff. I think we ought to make that distinction because there's some things in there I wouldn't apply to.
Yeah, maybe it's just, given what Anya's just said, maybe the solution to my quandary is to just add the word urban into 2.1.2 and just say increase urban forest resilience.
That would work for me.
That would make it clearer that that's what that is, and as opposed to Mission Trail Nature Preserve. We shouldn't really, I don't want us to forget Forest Hill Park, because that's a forest. That seems to be somewhere in the middle. And to that same, in that same line of thinking, Pescadero Canyon we own half of Pescadero Canyon is also in Carmel. And so we need to remember that too. That's a concern over here in my neighborhood. The fire chief has sort of tried to ratchet down our alarm at fire coming through Pescadero Canyon because of the topography, but it's something we should be aware of. I don't know. Anya, so I would kind of leave it to you and Rincon to figure out how to get those things to this plan.
Okay, we can do that.
For what it's worth, I agree with everything you just said. We have different park classifications. Mission Trail and Pescadero are considered natural parklands and preserves. And then the other parks around town, like Forest Hill, are considered improved parklands.
I guess we could take that conversation offline. To me, Forest Hill Park seems pretty natural, even though it's pretty, I know it's pretty skinny what you're saying, but it's definitely not taken care of in the way that most of the other small parks in town are.
I agree.
Yeah, and I think this is an important distinction. I mean, if we're thinking about it in terms of fire, there could be, you might talk about it differently versus if you're talking about habitat. So the part of this one is habitat. It's having a corridor for wildlife and birds, and that's all that's written up in the preserve plan, but that's not something we talk about in our urban forest so much. So
yeah, that's in fact, to me, that's a really kind of astute observation, that we talk about the forest in terms of the trees, but not the things that live in the trees. So I think that's a great comment. I would also say, back to the Forest Hill thing again, like, how do we manage Forest Hill Park? Like, we don't, how should we be managing Forest Hill Park? Because right now it doesn't get managed at all. It's more like Mission Trail, if even that, than it is like my neighborhood parks or the urban forest in terms of what we do right now.
This is all really good, valuable feedback for us to make some of those more actionable actions, I guess, making them easier to implement is providing some of this clarification. We also got a comment that says maybe reach out to Cal State Monterey Bay to conduct an analysis on the current state of the forest as well. And that once the fire gets into the canopies of the trees, it's all connected to a certain degree. So maybe that's looking at making sure that the management of all the forests is happening holistically. Can't just manage one without the other. So maybe prioritizing management of all of them. If there's no other comments on the forest, we also have another, oh wait, we got a forest comment here. Forest Hill is in desperate need for major renovation work. Never take my children there. So other safety issues, not just climate safety issues, sounds like other safety issues.
I would say to that comment, Nancy, that the children's portion of Forest Hill Park, where the playground equipment is, seems pretty safe as compared to the uphill part, the rest of the park between there and the tennis court.
All right, Ryan, is your stop sharing so I move on to the next policy?
I think so.
Okay. All right, under the resilience adaptation, this is our last goal, a couple policies here. So the policy is to support greater resilience, redundancy, and reliability of local and regional infrastructure and built environment. So we have actions including undergrounding utilities in the fire hazard zone, increasing green infrastructure by developing a green infrastructure pilot program, reducing stormwater runoff through a stormwater diversion project, do storm drain repair funding improvements, retrofitting existing critical buildings and related infrastructure, looking at water conservation by partnering with Monterey Peninsula Water Management District to reduce water demand and increase water recycling, providing information and incentives for residential water use reduction. We also have a bluff structural monitoring program to do follow-up monitoring post-storm to identify additional footing stability issues. Also, again, hiring a coastal engineer. So we talked about that one. And under this action right now, we have to conduct sea level rise vulnerability assessments and develop thresholds to engage certain adaptation measures like more beach nourishment. So maybe that one could be potentially edited to get their sense in terms of what's the highest priority to do first. And then lastly, wastewater treatment, collaborating with the wastewater district to increase the facility's resilience to sea level rise and stronger storms. And then policy 3.2 is incorporate climate change adaptation into relevant plans and standards. So develop a guidance project checklist for building and site adaptation measures, incorporating climate change adaptation into local plans and prioritizing the update of those plans, like the city's local coastal plan, updating the shoreline management plan based on the results of the sea level rise vulnerability study, and making sure that the multi-jurisdictional hazard mitigation plan is continually updated, which it's changed now on a regulatory process every 5 years, but maybe if there's new data or new policies, updating it sooner. So those are the infrastructure resilience strategies. I feel like we talked about a lot of these, but if there's anything else that we hadn't talked about that people want to discuss, like a project checklist, a lot about planning and the studies, priorities of maybe which ones you think the city's in most need for, like the green infrastructure pilot program, storm drainage, undergrounding utilities. Folks have thoughts on any of these, or do you think we've covered a lot of this already?
I think we've covered most of this stuff. My comment would be maybe we should move the coastal engineer sort of to the top to highlight that that's a sort of an unfinished area of business. We talked about that before, but I'm reading Laura's comment about the fire chief in Big Sur. And we had when we did touch on this a few meetings ago, where we talked about interfacing with the surrounding agencies to reduce the fire risk, because Laura's exactly right. We have Pescadero Canyon over where I live in an unincorporated county up above us. And it would be worthwhile to have some sort of program to manage that. I noticed on this one, on action 3.1.9, you have the wastewater treatment. And when we talked about that, we talked about having sort of a liaison between the city and COD. And I think that's probably in the packet for today's meeting. I noticed that all of the planning documents that we produced were in there. So there's a lot of information, Lexi, in those documents that address a lot of these things. So that liaison to COD, the COD what happens to be one that I wrote, that liaison is an idea in there. So is an idea that's documented that we talked about a lot of months ago at this point. But when you go back and you refine these actions and maybe make them more specific, you'll find a lot of detail in all of this stuff that we have done. And we tried to document all of that stuff in all of those documents that were in the packet.
Great, thank you. That's a good comment. We'll definitely take a look at those. And maybe city, this is meant for a policy document, but developing an implementation plan that provides some more of those details in terms of like who would be responsible for developing this, which agency, maybe some of those costs that people had talked about, that could be a part of it as well.
Yeah, this goes back to the comment I made earlier about sort of drilling down a little bit on the detail. Like the liaison to COD is just something we should do. Like there's no real work involved. We should just assign someone to be responsible for making sure they're on track. To use a really easy, straightforward example of something to lift out of those.
Yeah, that's great. So much work goes into those. It's good to build off of that. All right, let's see a couple comments in here. What are the action plans on these 3.1 policies? I don't know if that discussion kind of speaks to that or if there was anything else we hadn't answered there. It also says, I'm almost positive that dual plumbing is to code now, which enables a structure to reuse its gray water for toilet flushing and irrigation, if I understand that correctly. I don't know if someone could confirm that. Intelligent landscaping design can definitely reduce water runoff. Yeah, and I think there might be some of that in the mitigation as well, in terms of having that landscaping design. And
yeah, there's a document about this area, I think, runoff, and both addressing runoff that individual homeowners can do to prevent runoff, which they're actually, I believe the individual homeowners are now required to manage all the runoff off of their property. So it was really more specific to sort of the city trying to manage the runoff and using mechanisms other than simply piping everything down into the ocean.
Got it. And then we have some more comments here in terms of the gray water, in terms of Carmel City Code allowing gray water, and it says California allows washing machine gray water only, I believe without a permit as well. So yeah, I'm not sure in terms of what the Carmel City Code is, but we can use whatever is in the code and see if that needs to be updated as part of this effort and could be an action item. Right. I think if people didn't have thoughts, we can also move on to the mitigation piece. But if anybody does want to bring something up before we do that, maybe last call for any adaptation thoughts. All right, hearing none, I'll bring up the slides, and then just let me know when you want me to change the slides, Michael.
So on the greenhouse gas side, mitigation side, goal 1 and goal 3, those are for, goal 1 is for residential, goal 3 is for existing businesses, increase the energy efficiency of existing residential and commercial units. And one overarching one that doesn't really get you any GHG reductions, but I think motivates people to get there is energy efficiency education and recognition in the residential and commercial sectors. Increasing participation in energy efficiency programs that 3CE and others provide. And then having home and business energy evaluations. Those are actually audits, which will help residents and business owners to understand where they could benefit from energy efficiency retrofits and which ones make the most sense to them. And at the core of this, where we would get GHG reductions, is actually implementing energy efficiency renovations of the existing buildings. So promote participation in green building programs that 3CE and others provide incentives to homeowners that convert to electrification, streamlining the permitting process for energy efficiency retrofits, and required green building programs for large commercial renovations. And we're still trying to land on exactly what size is the right size for large. Next slide. So goals 2 and 4 pertain to new residential and commercial units. Educate city staff and community on the future Title 24 compliance. Promote Tier 1 and Tier 2 green building standards, which is the voluntary green building standards go above and beyond Title 24. Incentivize electrification. I would say require electrification of new residential units and require electrification of commercial units with certain exemptions where they can show that natural gas is required for their business, such as restaurants and other businesses that just have to have natural gas. And then, of course, streamlining the permitting process for these Tier 1 and Tier 2 green building applications. Kind of complementary to that is goal number 9, which is increase the clean energy use, incentivize solar panel installation for residential and small commercial, promote energy storage systems with the installation of solar panels. And the idea here of having energy storage, battery storage, if you will, is that the homeowner can actually get off of the grid and use their storage during peak times of energy use. That in turn reduces the need for peaker units, which are natural gas, and would provide at a grid scale some reductions. Require large commercial renovations to install solar panels, and then encourage residents and businesses to participate in 3CE's 100% renewable program. So we're going to pause here. If you go to the next slide, just to ask if we missed anything and what policies and actions should be prioritized. And I'll apologize in advance. I don't have the nifty panel there where I can put your questions up the way Ryan did, but I am taking notes.
Michael, we've actually got it all set up for you, so I can share my screen again and take notes for you if you like.
Oh, thank you.
Like to see the teamwork. Thank you.
Yes.
So we're about. We got a comment that reach codes are a fantastic tool if we want to create some change, and Santa Cruz is doing a very good job of utilizing reach codes.
Yeah, we had a conversation about this, and I think I know that we produced something. We're talking about those documents, and I don't remember. My guess is that the document that we produced is in the staff report for this meeting. We had a pretty lengthy conversation about not only the electrification of new homes, but about the electrification of existing remodels. There are a lot of remodels in town that really could have the same building codes applied to them. So when we speak about having new homes be electrified, at least half of the big remodels in town could have the same code applied to them. So we should definitely make a distinction. Someone should decide, the city should have as part of its process, this decision about whether a remodel is going to be subject to the electrification requirement. So that's one comment I had from the chart, Michael, that you had that's in the staff report. Another one, and so just to sort of reiterate, we had a conversation about basically requiring new homes to be electric vehicle ready. So that someone could literally call an electrician, go to City Hall, pay $100, buy a permit, and not have to rip out any walls to install an EV charger. So putting something near the street or the driveway or whatever that might be. We had the same conversation, in fact, also about battery storage. So with these new, just to pick one item, with these new Tesla walls, and I think John has one, we had a conversation about requiring homes to be Tesla wall ready as well, to be battery storage ready as well as being solar ready. So I know that this technology is really sort of evolving probably right as we speak here, but these things are, we've talked about them, and I think that they're all sort of documented in terms of what we do. I'm afraid, Michael, given that chart that you had at the beginning, that if we're not more aggressive, that we won't reach that 2030 goal. All the things that I saw in the presentation that you did, the couple of slides that we just had, were sort of promote and incentivize, and the word that I thought that was missing was require. And I'm afraid if we don't have some requirements, that we won't meet the goal that we've set out. So that's a concern of mine, and I hope that the modeling will ferret all this stuff out as we sort of proceed down.
Yes, and I agree. The largest amount of emissions are going to continue to come from the existing built environment. And because of that, that's a real challenge. The city needs to have some kind of hook, if you will, to require things, which is why we had a lot of incentivize and promote. But where the city can, like large remodels of homes, when it gets to a certain size, they're required to go to Title 24. You can require electrification at that point and that kind of thing. So that gets to that.
I think something we preliminarily discussed was the fire sprinkler requirement. Fire sprinklers are required when a certain threshold of wall length is altered. And I think we were exploring the idea of something similar to that. And then I have a question for, I don't know, anyone can really answer it, but I'm curious what an incentive would look like. I'm struggling to think, short of streamlining, which we already have to streamline a lot of these permits anyway. What could we as the city do to encourage someone to basically go out of their way to do something like this?
10 extra square feet of built space.
Yes. One thing I would say on the EV ready component, that'll be discussed. I think it's goal 7 where we talk about transportation, but it naturally fits into renovating a home.
Yeah, we got an email from Michael about requiring EV chargers on every block. I don't know if that's necessarily, and I guess someone should forward this email to you, Michael. I don't know if that's necessarily appropriate for here as opposed to just requiring it in houses, but it's definitely something we should probably look at.
I
think also in sort of that same thing, having more EV chargers downtown, like I think Carrie has one at her hotel that she spent 15 months trying to get installed, or some big number of months like that. Having these things at hotels would make an enormous difference in how people get here.
Well, yeah, and that speaks to streamlining the permit process if it took 15 months to get an EV charger installed.
I think Carrie's problem was PG&E. I don't think it was the city. Was it, Carrie?
Well, I looked into it during COVID, and unfortunately, the biggest expense was boosting the electrical box or my electric. That there is a lot of promotions and incentives to get the charger, but it's actually boosting your electrical unit to make sure it can take 1, 2, or 3 cars and do handle the electrical flow. So that's where the big expense was. So I haven't done it yet, but there are a couple of hotels that do have them already. So I think the hotel industry is moving in that direction. Yes.
Yeah, and I think, we have some city EV chargers around town, but I don't know whether they're enough or they're right. I would sort of look to Evan, not to Evan per se, but look to planning to sort of figure out whether we have enough of those things to meet, whatever our future needs might be. I would have no idea how to do.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that we got a few comments in the comment box. And Brian Sowers mentioned that there are federal and state monies for incentives. So that goes back to the grant question, I think. And then I think Laura mentioned adding EV chargers on Ocean Avenue and also possibly at the Plaza and at Sunset Center. We already have a few at Sunset Center, but we could definitely do more.
Maybe putting every single EV charger up at Vista Lobos would be a way to get people to park up there.
There you go. Yeah, so we've migrated into transportation, which I'll get into in just a little bit. Sorry to silo you guys.
On the reduced solid waste, we mentioned last time the concept of the city incentivizing or requiring disassembly of buildings rather than just having them demolished and sent to the landfill.
Yes.
Michael, do you want me to pull up that slide for you since we're on these topics? Or do people need them?
Before we move on to the next set of slides, is there anything on energy efficiency, renewable energy, battery storage, electrification of homes and businesses that we need to discuss? Okay, let's move on. So you'll be a little frustrated because we get into the urban heat island and urban forests first, but we'll quickly get into transportation, solid waste.
Is this the right slide?
I think so. So
Okay.
water conservation, Carmel is already doing an excellent job of water conservation. Little places that could improve include making sure that we have recycled water for all of the landscape irrigation, commercial and multifamily as well. And then gray water systems, allowing permits for gray water systems. And I saw that that came up during the adaptation portion. And promote rainwater harvesting. Those are just a few things to help stretch the water conservation even more that Carmel is already doing. On decreasing energy demand through the heat island effect, maintaining the health of the urban forest canopy. So there's going to be some challenges because of the combination of high heat and droughts that we need to have some adaptation, maybe update the urban forest canopy guidelines and making sure that that's kept healthy, and then modifying the codes a little bit to allow a greater amount of rooftop surfaces that are cool roofs. And where feasible, using cool pavement options when repaving roadways. So move on to the next slide. So decreasing emissions through reducing VMT, and this is not just reducing VMT, but also electrifying the fleet. Developing a bicycle master plan, and I'll say this right here, that Carmel is in a unique position. It has very narrow streets. So that bicycle master plan, just identifying routes, would require signage and an education program to the drivers and bicyclists and pedestrians that you're all sharing the road, and making sure that you're able to do that. It's very common in Europe, but a little unusual here. And I think Carmel has a opportunity to actually enhance its community character by having that old European style mix of traffic, if you will. Ride sharing and bike work to work programs within the businesses. We already talked a lot about electrifying the vehicle infrastructure, and we're certainly going to continue to take comments on that. But one other thing I wanted to talk about is neighborhood electric vehicles. Most of the streets within, especially downtown Carmel and in the neighborhoods of Carmel, have speed limits that would allow the use of electric vehicles and, neighborhood electric vehicles, and then neighborhood electric vehicle shuttles. And I'll just ask this question of all of you. Are you familiar with neighborhood electric vehicles? They're not the standard on the highway kind of vehicle that you would take on the freeway, but they're more robust than what a golf cart would be.
We have a few running around town.
Yeah, so Carmel's really made for these because of the fairly narrow streets. This actually enhances that bicycle idea because they take up less space, they go slower speeds, and just would, I think, also promote that community character I think that you guys would want to have. And having any of these shuttles between the hotels and different places within the city is a good idea as well. Then the last one was a shuttle service between the Monterey Airport and destinations in the city. So the goal 8, which I think is the last one we have before we go to see your thoughts, is promoting zero waste events, promote home composting, promote reusable containers rather than recyclables. So shopping bags were already going that way, expanding that process, and then educating the community, not just on the use of the city provided containers, but also the advantages of going zero waste. So with that, I think we can take on your comments.
Anybody?
Yeah. While we're waiting, I wanted to really promote NEVs a little more in that they are a lot cheaper than a full-size EV, and great for running around town. They don't have the range that a full-sized EV has, but for having short trips of 6, 8, 10 miles, they're perfect.
I have a little comment and a big comment. The little comment is about water. Michael, I've run through these mental exercises in my mind about trying to get rainwater harvesting to pay off here when we have basically a rainy season and a dry season. And I've just never been able to make that sort of pencil out. On the other hand, like I would say, for example, if we lived in the desert where it rains 6 times a year and we could have a big storage tank, it seems like having a storage tank here would only get me 1 round trip of water a year. And so I have a hard time making it pencil out. But I think that there's a lot of promise in gray water systems here, especially for people that full-time residents that use water in their homes, in their showers, and in their showers and their washing machines. And I saw a comment a few minutes ago about Justin Pauly made an AIA event about dual plumbing houses. And I think that there is some really good work that could be done at very minimal expense, especially with new homes that are being built or these extensive remodels, as far as dual plumbing houses, so that they could be sort of gray water ready, just like they're EV ready. I also think, given the scarcity of water here, that this is an area, my own feelings would be that this is an area that's sort of ripe for real incentives in terms of getting people to install gray water systems. Gray water systems are kind of complicated and kind of finicky, and not the easiest things in the world to really manage. It's another plumbing device, but I think that there's probably some good work that could be done in that particular area, and maybe we could explore that a little bit about what we might do.
Yeah, part of it is an education program on gray water, so there is some maintenance involved. Even when you have a plumbed well, you need to filter out lint and other things before it gets to the irrigation system, and those filters need to be regularly cleaned.
And then my big comment, and the way I think what we've laid out so far is really lacking is in transportation, is in VMTs. And I don't think that the things that are on, I didn't think that the things that were in the staff report or this presentation really go far enough to address the VMT issue. I call it the VMT issue, but the transportation issue that we have in town. We spoke, I think last month when you sort of made your introduction, we spoke about trying to segregate out the VMTs and the people that work here versus the people that visit here versus the people that live here, using an origin destination model. And I don't see, obviously I think the committee decided that we should use this origin destination model, but I don't see anything on the list really about reducing the number of trips into town. Like I see, reducing the number of cars running around our streets, which is clearly a good thing, maybe not quite climate related, but I would be all for that. But what I think we really need to do is reduce the number of cars that are coming into town. I think that's where the numbers are, and I think that's what we're going to have to do. And whether that's through more bus usage, increased bus usage. I saw a comment that someone said suggested that the buses be free, and I think that's an excellent idea if someone's going to pay for it, and maybe the city should pay for it to get, to get the workers that come into town to take the bus, or have free bus passes. I know Carrie gives a number of her employees bus passes to get to town, which keeps 10 cars off of our street. So I think that that's sort of an area we could work on, sort of the bus pass idea. But most of all, we just need to get people to not drive. And I don't think we're ever going to meet our goals unless we have people not driving into town. And I don't see a lot of stuff in here. There's more stuff in the staff report about getting people to not drive, and whether that's building housing in town or, to take, 150 people off of the road if we had employee housing, somewhere in town or whatever. But we're going to have to do that anyway as part of the RENA process, which starts pretty soon. But I think that we really need to address that in terms of how we think about reducing that number, because I think that's going to be very difficult to bring down.
You're right in that it's going to be very difficult to bring down. I love your ideas about maybe reallocating land use, like having housing in downtown, worker housing in downtown. That would reduce a certain amount of it. What I'm finding is I'm looking at the division of those trips is that a significant number of them are tourism. Those are going to be the hardest of all to reduce. Once they're here, though, keeping them out of their car, I think, is a viable thing.
Yeah, I agree that it's a difficult problem, but our economy is responsible for that. I don't know what to do about it. I don't know what the possible limits are, but I think it's something that should be really at the top of our mind. Like, how do we get people out of their cars to get here? I don't know what the answer is, but someone must know.
All right. One I can think of is if somehow you diverted a lot of those people coming from Southern California, San Francisco, farther destinations to use Monterey Airport and then a shuttle into town. That would reduce VMT. We won't talk about the aircraft emissions.
The AMTs.
There's some comments here in the chat about electronic parking fees for visitors. I feel like that's something that maybe there could be some equity and coastal commission issues there too, though. But
yeah, paid parking is coming. So, well, unless something untoward happens, I see Carrie nodding her head. So yeah. Everybody on the council is on board with that right now, at least. So.
Gotcha. There's also about a shuttle service at the top of Ocean Ave by the high school during weekends, and use electric shuttles to get people in and out of downtown. Maybe it doesn't need to be 2 lanes in each direction. Maybe make 1 lane in each direction to be more suited to bikes and pedestrians, more of a walking village. And then the shops and restaurants could incentivize that with discounts and freebies that the cities could subsidize.
I love these ideas.
Yeah, to me, if we could get every single person that works in town to not drive, we would be halfway there towards meeting this goal. And I don't know how possible that is. What the cost of doing that would be, what the organization would be required to have late night buses for restaurant workers, or get the restaurant owners, for just to use an example, put their workers on the same schedule so that we could plan to have late night buses. I don't know what the answer to these things are, but there's a lot of room there, I think, if we can figure it out.
Yeah, I agree, because that is your third largest sector of emissions, transportation. And this will be the hardest one to tackle. It always is.
When you do this modeling, you know, and we talk about VMTs, do our VMTs go down? So if one of those workers that works at Carrie's hotel that's not taking the bus and is driving, if we had an ideal model and that worker shifts from a gas powered car to an electric powered car, do our VMTs actually go down? Would we be able to show that? Do we monitor that sort of thing?
So they have kind of a protocol and practice in traffic modeling. Going from a gas-powered car to an electric vehicle is not what they call a mode shift. So it would not reduce VMT. What it would reduce is the emissions associated with VMT. Since as our grid goes to 100% renewables, those emissions go down to zero. But the VMT is still counted. Oddly enough, when you have a neighborhood electric vehicle, that's considered a mode shift in the transportation world. So that is actually a reduction of VMT. So if people were to start using, and they'd have to be local, but local people were to start to using NEVs, that reduces VMT, as does bicycling and pedestrian and using the bus. So I see something really attractive here for the city of Carmel, and that is this community character that complements this idea of having a more pedestrian, bike-friendly environment. I think there's a synergy in that so that the community really buys into it. So everyone's gotten very quiet. Are there any other just general comments or suggestions broadly on adaptation or mitigation?
Yeah, that was the end of our slide deck. We just have a couple more on next steps. So yeah, it's a good call to see if there are any final thoughts, any things we didn't cover that people want to bring up now before we close out. All right, not hearing any. Is it Evan? Will be presenting the last slides?
Yep. Yeah, so just a very brief overview of our next steps. What we'll do is we'll refine the strategy tables based on the feedback from the workshop. Once that's done, the next step would be to develop cost ranges and implementation timelines and identify primary implementation parties. Then the last step is to finalize the climate adaptation and action plans. So that's concludes our workshop. Any additional comments or questions can be sent to Agnes. Her email is listed below. She will field all the questions and comments and disseminate them as appropriate.
Question. I have a question, Evan.
Sure.
So let's just take the greenhouse gas stuff, which we had a lot of conversation about here at the end. Michael, will you produce like some sort of draft plan that we'll be able to look at and sort of screw around with a little bit to decide whether this is good enough or not good enough or whatever based on your estimates? Is that sort of what's going to happen next?
The next step is actually to put out a technical report that'll show the emissions, the forecasts, the reduction quantification and a refinement of those reduction measures and how you could achieve those targets. ENIAS, I think, is going to be putting out the actual plan, but we're providing the technical information to help her with that. And one big hurdle of that is actually we're not doing an origin destination model because that's just out of the budget. But what we are doing is doing some out of model calculations on the percentage of those VMT that are tourism versus commuters versus just totally within the city, going shopping, going to school, things like that. And providing a per trip vehicle mile estimate for each of those types of trips.
So I thought we had decided that we were, and now I'm going to probably put Agnes on the spot. I thought we had decided that we were going to do an origin destination model, that we were kind of okay with that. Is that just out of budget and Carrie and I need to scrounge up some more money, which we're not really looking forward to doing? Like what's the issue there? Like how do we capture, you know, I think it's important to the committee that we capture the emissions from people coming to work and people coming to visit. Like it doesn't make any sense to do a road, you know, a road VMT here, a road model here, because we don't really have any roads compared to what people in town do. So how are we going to fix that?
So
maybe you should let Agnes answer, or Evan,
sure,
or Bob Harari before you. I'm not trying to put you on the spot, Michael.
I'm going to do my best. I'm not at 100%, so we don't have the funding to do a full-on model effort. So the idea is to use the data we already have and massage it to get somewhere close to an origin destination, is my understanding. But we don't have the funding to do a full-on model. So we're going to do the best we can with what we have. And we'll use the existing data collected by AMBAC. And Michael, please correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm misspeaking.
You're not wrong. What we're doing is we're taking AMBAG's work and providing a percentage of those VMTs that are visitor versus commute versus totally within the city, not commute, but other types of trips, and then assigning miles to those trips. This is all out of the model to give you more of a range of what an origin destination model would do. It is not the same as an origin destination model. So for a traffic engineer to do the modeling that you'd want is on the realm of 20 to 30,000. There's also another option, and that is using cell data or some other big data providers that can give us real-time information on the trips and the VMT and where they're going in a block. And that's also in the range of $20,000 to $24,000 to do that. But that would give you an accurate picture of where the different trips are coming from and going to.
So right now, so under the sort of fake origin destination model that you're proposing, this the employee that Carrie has that commutes 15 miles from Seaside to Carmel, how many of those, and then 15 miles back, how many of those miles are we going to see in this sort of fake VMT model? Are we going to see 15? Are we going to see a half, which is the amount of time that Carrie's employee spends on Carmel roads? Or are we going to see 30, or do we know?
So there's a protocol. Once you've figured out what the mileage is for those trips that go, either have an origin in Carmel or a destination in Carmel, but the other end of that trip is outside of Carmel, And that protocol has us multiply that total trip, if it's 15 miles, by 0.5. So that would be 7.5 miles. And then, of course, the return trip would be the same thing. And what I'm finding in getting those percentages is your tourism trips are extremely long. They're in the hundreds of miles. And even when you apply that 0.5 to them, there's your big challenge. So you would see that on-road transportation sector grow a lot. It would definitely become the largest, and the most difficult to change would be the ones that have the biggest amount of miles per trip in them.
So I would say I'm sort of okay with this. I'm not sure I'm okay with this, and maybe I do need to have a conversation with Chip and the council. And I'm sure Carrie's really rolling her eyes when I say that, because we definitely do not want to have that conversation. But I think from my own perspective, it would be nice to have a benchmark that we can use. So the employees, I think, Michael, you're exactly right. I think we can make a guess about the employees. We could survey the businesses downtown and make a guess about where they're coming from and how many there are, I guess, would be the sort of the two of the big factors in terms of how many miles we have from the employees coming into town. But the visitor thing, is an issue that we need to struggle with. And I don't know, this is one of those things that we don't know. Like, I don't know what the scope of the number is, how big of an issue this is, but those miles belong to someone. And I don't know whether it's us. I don't know whether it's San Francisco. I don't know whether it's San Jose, where the person is passing through. I don't know what the answer to those questions are, but we're never going to figure this. We're never going to know, and we're never going to be able to address the impact of the community on the planet unless we start somewhere. And even if we're not going to measure our progress in sort of getting to, zero emissions by this goal, these miles, some fraction of them belong to us. We take money from tourists, and some fraction of this environmental damage belongs to us. And I don't know what that number is, but I think that we need to become comfortable as a community with just understanding that, and I think it's that understanding. I think it's that education. We talk a lot about education in terms of sort of educating the community about evacuation routes and fire risk and all those things. And I think that this is, to me, this is just as important. This is a step in educating the community. Like, producing these numbers is a step, and it may not be the right one. And it may be, Michael, that even the $20,000 isn't going to give us that VMT estimate for tourism. I mean, I don't know how a traffic engineer is going to go to Carrie and ask her where her guests are coming from, or how to allocate miles from someone that flies here from Japan and visits 4 cities in California and then flies back. How many of those miles are ours? Like, I don't know what the answer to those questions are, but we'll never have a good data set unless we have a bad data set first that we can think about and sort of understand the scope. And that would be my ask, that we make progress towards understanding what that number is as we sort of move forward.
So I don't want to call
money to do that. So
I'm not going to call what I am doing right now with VMT as a bad guess, but it is certainly a guess as opposed to an actual modeling exercise. But we do get a good sense from the tourism industry where people are coming from, not specific to a particular hotel, but just to Carmel. And I think that is good enough in us understanding how many miles those are.
I agree with all that. So I would just like us to get started. I don't know what, it's not going to be perfect, and I don't expect it to be perfect or even, and with no offense to your abilities, even very good. But it's a start. It's the first step towards figuring this out, figuring our impact out. And I think it's important that we take that step, just
Yes.
so we can sit on the data. And even if we have to sit on it for 2 years, and even if it's not great data, we'll sit on it for 2 years. And then in 2 years, we'll think about what we need to do better so we can have a better estimate 2 years from now.
And the end goal here is to try and reduce emissions. And there's a two-pronged approach. One is to try and eliminate those trips where you can, and the other is to electrify them. So the city can definitely encourage electric vehicles through chargers and a parking fee program that would disincentivize some types of cars and incentivize others.
Thank you for letting me say that.
All right.
Well, I've really appreciated the presentation and the way that we captured people's comments. So Ryan, Lexi, and Michael, thank you for that. That's been really good. Thank you.
Of course, thank you for all the thoughtful feedback. It was great working with you guys, even for 3 hours. I was like, that's a long time, but this was so interesting, and you guys have such good insights into your community. It was good for us too.
Listen, I enjoy the overlap you have. I mean, we were talking about GHGs while we were in adaptation, and obviously some of the GHG reduction measures feed into adaptation. So thank you for that comprehensive.
Yes, thank you all.
overview.
Very, very, very well done. Thank you very much.
Yes, and thank you to everyone for filling in for me. I'll be better next time.
Get well, Anyas.
Thanks, everyone, and feel better, Anyas.
Thank you. We'll see you all next month.
All
Thanks
right.
very much.
Take care.